When we speak of the empath, we are not speaking merely of a sensitive individual, a fragile personality who happens to feel the tremors of the world more intensely than others. We are speaking of a deeper reality, of the hidden child within the adult body, of the soul that once learned the secret code of survival by reading every subtle change in the atmosphere of the home, by predicting the storm before it broke, by detecting the sigh before it became a cry, by absorbing pain in order to stay alive. The empath is not born in the light, but rather they are forged in the dim corridors of childhood, where love was not given freely, but was always conditional, always attached to pain, silence, or sacrifice. That is why I say, the empath is the child who learned love through pain. This truth is dark because it reveals the inversion of what should have been. Love, in its pure form, should flow like a spring, effortless, nourishing the child who receives it. But for the empath, love became a dangerous labyrinth, a puzzle they had to solve to remain connected. And so they learned, unconsciously, that to be loved meant to abandon their own needs, to silence their cries, to anesthetize their anger, and to make themselves an instrument tuned only to the music of others. In this way, selfishness was not only forbidden, it was equated with the threat of abandonment. The child discovered that to be accepted, they must not exist as themselves, but as an echo of the emotions of those around them. You see, the psyche, like the great mythological stories, carries within it the paradox of life. What protects the child in the moment becomes the curse of the adult. The empathic gift that once allowed survival becomes the prison of identity. To feel everything is not a blessing in its original form. It is the scar tissue of a soul that was denied its own sovereignty. But the unconscious does not forget. Deep in the shadow lies the abandoned child, the one who was never permitted to be selfish, never allowed to declare, I am, and I want, and I feel. That child remains trapped in the archetypal image of the wounded one, seeking endlessly for the love that once came bound with pain. Think for a moment of the myths that have guided humanity through millennia. Consider the story of Chiron, the wounded healer, struck by a wound that never healed. He became the teacher of gods and heroes, wise in the art of healing, precisely because he himself bore the incurable pain. The empath is a modern incarnation of this myth. They heal others because they themselves were never healed. They feel others because their own feelings were silenced. They become the healer of the collective wound because they carry within their unconscious the image of the wound of the world. But like Chiron, their wisdom is born of agony, and their gift is inseparable from their wound. I tell you, the greatest danger for the empath is not that they feel too much, but that they lose themselves entirely in what they feel. They live as if their skin is torn open and the world pours in, but they cannot locate the boundary of their own being. To them, selfishness is still the original sin, because somewhere in their memory lies the fear that to express their own need is to trigger rejection, anger, or abandonment. And so they continue the pattern. They give, they absorb, they sacrifice, and they call it love. But underneath, the unconscious cries out, "This is not love. This is survival disguised as virtue." The empath stands at the threshold. On one side is the old pattern, the endless repetition of the childhood wound, projected onto lovers, friends, and strangers. On the other side is the possibility of individuation, of reclaiming the abandoned child and restoring them to life. But individuation demands confrontation with the shadow. It requires that the empaths admit to themselves that their gift is also their wound, that their selflessness is also their defense mechanism, that their compassion is often rooted not in freedom, but in fear. This recognition is painful because it feels like a betrayal of identity. If I am not the one who feels for everyone, who am I if I no longer absorb what remains of me? But this is the necessary suffering of awakening. Dreams often speak with images more truthful than words. Imagine, for instance, a dream in which a child is standing in a burning house, holding in their arms a fragile bird. The child refuses to flee until the bird is safe, but as the fire consumes the walls, the bird transforms into smoke and disappears. The child remains alone, coughing, weakened, still clutching empty air. This dream would reveal to us the truth of the empath. They clutch the suffering of others as if it were a fragile creature, believing that their duty is to keep it alive. Yet what they protect dissolves, and what remains is their own exhaustion, their own destruction. This is the archetypal image of love through pain. The unconscious does not lie. It whispers through dreams, symbols, and bodily symptoms. The empath's fatigue, their chronic sorrow, their inability to say, no, these are not defects of personality. They are messages from the shadow, calling them back to the forgotten truth. You too deserve to exist. You too are allowed to want. You too may be selfish without losing love. Until this realization dawns, the empath is condemned to live in projections. They will attract partners who exploit their giving nature. They will find themselves in friendships where they are the caretaker, and they will mistake exploitation for intimacy. This is not destiny. It is the repetition compulsion of the wound. Freud named it so. But I see it as the archetypal cycle of the unloved child seeking redemption in every embrace. But let us go deeper into the symbolic realm where psyche and spirit meet. The archetype of the child is one of the central motifs in the collective unconscious. It represents both vulnerability and potential, both the wound and the possibility of rebirth. When the empath identifies with the wounded child, they live only one side of the archetype. They remain trapped in vulnerability, unable to access the regenerative power of the child. the divine spark of new beginnings. To truly individuate, the empath must reconcile these opposites. They must take the hand of the wounded child within and say, you no longer need to carry the pain of others to be loved. You are loved because you exist. This is the alchemical transformation of the empathic wound, turning survival into sovereignty, turning pain into power. The journey is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. For the empath, every encounter is a mirror of the original wound. Each time they feel unappreciated, invisible, or drained, they are reliving the childhood moment when love was withheld. To heal is not to deny their sensitivity, but to reframe it. Sensitivity is not weakness, nor is it only the result of trauma. Sensitivity, when integrated, is a faculty of the soul, an antenna of the unconscious that perceives what others cannot. But to reach this integration, the empath must first separate the gift from the wound. They must recognize that their empathy is not owed to everyone, that their compassion need not annihilate their own existence. They must dare to become selfish in the sacred sense, to acknowledge that the self, the inner nucleus of the psyche, is the true center of life. Individuation, then, is the act of returning to oneself. It is the calling back of projections, the withdrawal of energy from the endless cycle of giving and sacrificing. It is the moment when the empath looks into the mirror and finally sees not the reflections of others, but their own face. This is terrifying, for it means confronting the loneliness of the abandoned child, the grief of never having been seen. But it is also liberating, for in that moment, the soul begins to breathe again. The empath ceases to be merely the child who learned love through pain and becomes the adult who chooses love through freedom. I have seen it many times in the lives of those who seek analysis. They come burdened, describing their endless exhaustion, their inability to stop caring for others. They speak of relationships where they feel consumed, yet unable to withdraw. They weep as they realize that beneath their compassion lies an ocean of resentment. And when we trace the thread back, it always leads to the same place, the childhood room where they learned that to cry was dangerous, to want was forbidden, to say no was betrayal. That is where the empath was born, not in a miracle of nature, but in a crucible of pain, and that is why their journey is both tragic and sacred, for in facing this truth, they hold the key to their own transformation. The shadow must be faced. The empath must allow themselves to feel the anger they repressed, the selfishness they denied, the hunger they silenced. These are not sins, but lost fragments of the self. The alchemist knew that the gold is found in the rejected material, the filth that others discard. Likewise, the empath's gold is hidden in the very traits they fear: selfishness, anger, desire. By integrating these, they become whole. They no longer need to seek love through pain, for they carry within them the fountain of love that arises from the self. And so, I say to you, the empath is not condemned to remain the child of pain. They are called to become the adult of wholeness, but this requires courage, the courage to betray the old law that said you must always give, always please, always dissolve. It requires the sacred rebellion of saying, I too exist, I too matter. This is not a rejection of compassion, but it's transfiguration. For only when you love yourself as fiercely as you love others can your empathy become true, free, and divine. When I tell you that the empath is the child who learned love through pain, I am also saying that this child never truly disappeared. Though the body grew, though the intellect expanded, though the world demanded maturity, the child remained frozen in the psyche, holding on to the primitive conviction that survival depends on attunement to others. This inner child watches every expression, listens to every silence, trembles at every sign of rejection. It is not the adult who reacts so intensely when a lover withdraws, when a friend becomes cold, when society ignores them. It is the child still believing that abandonment equals annihilation. Thus the empath lives two lives. The outward one of an adult who appears generous, compassionate, endlessly giving, and the inner one of a frightened child, still begging to be seen. You must understand that the unconscious preserves everything. Nothing is ever lost. The sighs of your mother, the frown of your father, the slamming of a door in your early years, they all leave their imprint, etched into the hidden fabric of the soul. When a child cannot process these impressions consciously, the psyche relegates them to the shadow. But the shadow does not remain silent. It seeks expression, often through repetition. That is why empaths find themselves in the same kind of relationship again and again. They unconsciously seek the original wound, hoping that this time it will resolve differently. They give to the neglectful partner, they comfort the abusive friend, they rescue the broken soul, because somewhere in their depths the child believes that if they can transform this present pain into love, it will redeem the past. But the unconscious does not heal through repetition alone. It heals through confrontation and integration. It is not enough to recognize intellectually that your empathy is born of pain. Knowledge alone does not transform. The alchemists knew this. They said that to turn lead into gold, one must endure the heat of the furnace, the dark night of dissolution. So too with the empath, you cannot merely observe your patterns from a safe distance. You must feel them. You must descend into the very wound you have avoided all your life. That descent is terrifying, for it feels like returning to the original helplessness, the loneliness of the child whose cries were unanswered. Yet without it, there can be no transformation. The darkness must be entered, not avoided in dreams. The empath's unconscious often appears as flooded landscapes, vast oceans, or drowning scenes. Water symbolizes emotion. the collective depths of feeling that threaten to submerge the ego. In Sucht dreams, the dreamer struggles to keep their head above water or searches for someone else who is drowning. These images reveal the psychic reality. The empath lives in the waters of others' emotions, barely able to find solid ground for themselves. Yet, the dream also contains the key. If the dreamer dares to dive instead of resist, if they surrender to the water, they often discover a hidden pearl or a treasure chest at the ocean floor. This is the symbol of individuation. The treasure is found not by escaping the flood, but by descending into it with consciousness. The empath must learn not only to feel, but to claim the gold hidden in their feeling, the recognition of their own self. We must also speak of the archetype of the mother. For many empaths, the distortion of love begins here. The mother's love may have been inconsistent, conditional, or overshadowed by her own wounds. The child learned that to be loved, they must comfort the mother, anticipate her moods, suppress their own needs to avoid her anger or sadness. In such cases, the child becomes the parent of the parent, a premature caretaker. This inversion is catastrophic for the psyche, for it disrupts the natural flow of development. Instead of receiving unconditional love, the child becomes a giver, reversing the archetypal pattern. And so, in adulthood, they repeat this role endlessly. Always the giver, never the receiver, always the caretaker, never the cared for. Until this pattern is made conscious, it enslaves them. Yet, the archetypes are not only prisons, they are also guides. The mother archetype has a dual face: the devouring mother, who consumes the child's individuality, and the nurturing mother, who gives life freely. The empath has known the first, but must learn to embody the second, not only for others, but for themselves. To become one's own nurturing mother is the beginning of healing. To say inwardly, I will hold you, I will love you, I will allow you to exist exactly as you are. When this inner voice awakens, the frozen child begins to thaw, the wound begins to close, and the adult emerges, not as a slave of compassion, but as a sovereign being who chooses when and how to give. There is another archetype that haunts the empath, the savior. They see themselves as the one who must rescue, redeem, fix what is broken. But the savior complex is a dangerous seduction. It offers a sense of purpose, yet it disguises the fear of facing one's own wound. To save others is easier than to heal oneself. To pour energy into the suffering of another is less frightening than to turn inward and confront the abandoned child within. But salvation sought externally never satisfies. The more the empath saves others, the more empty they feel, for their own soul remains untouched. The true salvation lies not in rescuing another, but in reclaiming oneself. Consider again the image of Christ on the cross. the archetypal symbol of suffering and redemption. Many empaths identify unconsciously with this image. They too feel crucified, sacrificed for the sins of others, bearing burdens not their own. But they forget that the story does not end with crucifixion. It moves toward resurrection. The empaths must allow their crucifixion to end. They must descend into the tomb of their shadow, but they must also rise transformed, carrying the wisdom of suffering without remaining enslaved to it. This is the alchemy of the empath's journey, not to be forever the wounded one, but to become the resurrected self. And yet, this process is not without danger, for the shadow, once repressed, returns with intensity. When acknowledged, the empath may feel overwhelming anger, resentment, even hatred toward those who wounded them. They may fear these emotions, believing them to be destructive or evil, but anger is not evil. It is the fire of the soul demanding recognition. It is the energy that says, I too exist. I too have boundaries. I too will no longer be erased. To deny this anger is to deny life itself. The task is not to suppress, but to integrate, to let the fire purify, not consume. When anger is owned consciously, it becomes strength, clarity, the ability to say no without anger. There can be no boundary, and without boundary, there can be no self. The empaths must also confront their projections. They believe they see others clearly, but often what they see is their own shadow cast upon the world. They perceive need in others because they deny their own need. They perceive suffering everywhere because their own suffering remains unhealed. They attract broken souls not by accident, but because their unconscious demands the confrontation. Only by withdrawing these projections, by saying, this is mine, not theirs, can they liberate themselves. This is perhaps the hardest task, for it feels like losing identity, but in truth, it is the beginning of real vision, of seeing others as they are, not as mirrors of one's own wound. Let me give you another dream, one I once heard from a patient. They dreamt of a great mirror in a dark room. When they looked into it, they saw not their own reflection, but the faces of all the people they had loved and cared for. Each face demanded attention. Each voice cried out. The dreamer felt exhausted, unable to find themselves. Then suddenly the mirror cracked, and through the shards they saw their own face, small but clear, hidden behind the crowd. This is the dream of the empath. The mirror is the projection of others, the faces of those they carried. But behind the shattering is the revelation of the self. To break the mirror is to break the illusion, to finally see one's own soul. What then is the path forward? It is not to renounce empathy, nor to harden the heart. It is to transfigure empathy into consciousness, to give freely, but not compulsively, to feel deeply, but not dissolve into feeling, to recognize that compassion without selfhood is not compassion, but sacrifice. The self does not demand annihilation, it demands wholeness. To be whole is to hold both the child and the adult, the wound and the healing, the darkness and the light. This is individuation, not perfection, but integration. The empath must dare to be selfish in the sacred sense. They must say, I will protect my energy, I will honor my needs, I will not be consumed. This selfishness is not the vice they fear, but the boundary that allows true love to exist. Without it, their giving is contaminated by resentment, their compassion by exhaustion. With it, their love becomes pure, flowing not from compulsion, but from freedom. Only then can empathy become what it was always meant to be, not survival through pain, but the radiance of a soul aligned with the self. I tell you, the empath's journey is one of paradox. They are both the most wounded and the most gifted, both the child of pain and the bearer of light. Their task is not to choose one or the other, but to embrace both, to honor the wound without becoming it, to accept the gift without losing themselves in it. This is the path of wholeness, the path that leads not to endless sacrifice, but to the fullness of being. And in this fullness, they discover the truth. Love is not earned by pain. It is not conditional upon self-erasure. Love simply is arising from the self, radiating outward, a fire that warms without burning. When we speak of the empath who learned love through pain, we must also recognize that such a pattern is not merely personal but collective. It is woven into the very fabric of our culture, into the archetypes that shape entire civilizations. Humanity itself has often confused love with sacrifice, compassion with self-annihilation, and care with servitude. From ancient myths to modern institutions, the story repeats. To be worthy of love, one must suffer, bleed, or deed to oneself. The empath is thus not only an individual psychological type, but a symbolic expression of this deeper cultural wound. And so, when an empath begins the journey of individuation, they are not only healing themselves, they are touching a collective wound, bringing into consciousness something that humanity at large has carried unconsciously for millennia. You may ask, why does the empath feel so much responsibility for others? It is because at the unconscious level, they carry the archetype of the Redeemer. They feel that by absorbing pain, by holding the brokenness of others, they will somehow restore harmony to the world. But the Redeemer archetype is double-edged in its light aspect. It points to compassion, service, and sacrifice for higher ideals. In its shadow aspect, it traps the individual in endless martyrdom, convincing them that their suffering is necessary for the salvation of others. The empath, caught in this shadow, becomes addicted to pain itself. As though pain were proof of love, they do not realize that this addiction binds them to a cycle of repetition in which their own soul is never free. Yet, beneath this compulsion lies a profound truth. The very sensitivity that has enslaved them is also the doorway to transformation, for sensitivity is not only the wound, it is also the instrument of consciousness. It allows them to perceive subtle dynamics, to sense the unconscious movements in others, to enter into the archetypal currents that shape human life. But until they claim their own boundaries, this gift becomes a curse. It is like holding a lamp in the darkness but forgetting to turn it toward oneself. The task is to reorient the light, to shine it inward, to illuminate the forgotten chambers of the soul where the wounded child waits. Only then can the empath's gift become what it was meant to be, not a prison of endless giving, but a path to depth, wisdom, and true compassion. The shadow will resist this. When the empath dares to turn inward, to say no to others, to reclaim energy for themselves, the shadow often unleashes its fury. Guilt arises, sharp and merciless, whispering, "You are selfish. You are abandoning them. You are unworthy of love." This guilt is the echo of the old law of childhood, the commandment that said, "You exist to serve, not to be." To break this law feels like betrayal, like a death. And in a sense, it is a death, the death of an old identity. But such a death is necessary, for without it, there can be no rebirth. The empath must die to the role of savior in order to be reborn as a whole self. Dreams again offer images of this transformation. One empath told me of a dream where they were carrying a heavy sack filled with crying infants. No matter how many they tried to soothe, more appeared, their cries multiplying until the dreamer collapsed under the weight. But in the moment of collapse, a single child emerged from the sack, the dreamer's own inner child, silent, wide-eyed, waiting to be acknowledged. This dream reveals the truth until the empath releases the illusion of saving everyone. They will never see the one who truly needs their care, their own soul. The multitude of crying infants symbolizes the endless projection of others' needs. The single silent child is the self-awaiting recognition. To turn towards this inner child is the beginning of true healing. The archetypal journey of the empath mirrors the myth of Persephone. She was taken into the underworld, forced to live among the dead, separated from her mother's light. But in that darkness she became queen, gaining wisdom of both realms. The empath, too, descends into the underworld of others' pain, drawn into shadows that are not their own, but if they remain there, they wither. Only when they return with consciousness, acknowledging both the darkness and the light, do they claim their sovereignty. They are no longer merely victims of their sensitivity, but rulers of their inner world, able to move between empathy and boundary, between giving and receiving, without losing themselves. This sovereignty is not coldness. It is not the hardening of the heart or the denial of compassion. On the contrary, it is the discovery of true love, the kind that does not demand self-erasure. For when the empath learns to love themselves, their compassion for others becomes clearer, freer, no longer entangled with unconscious wounds. They give but not compulsively. They care, but not to their own destruction. Their love becomes an expression of the self, not a desperate attempt to earn survival. This is the alchemical transformation. Love through pain transfigured into love through freedom. But how does one begin this transformation? In the practical sense, it begins with awareness, with the courage to observe one's own patterns without judgment. When you feel compelled to rescue, pause and ask, is this truly my responsibility? Or is it the voice of the child within still begging for love? When you feel drained after an interaction, ask, where did I abandon myself? When you feel guilty for setting a boundary, ask, whose voice is this guilt? Is it mine or the echo of the past? Such questions are not mere intellectual exercises. They are keys to unlocking the unconscious. Each time you pause, each time you withdraw projection, you reclaim a fragment of your soul. Slowly, the child who lived only for others begins to awaken, to breathe, to stand. The process is rarely linear. It comes in waves, like the sea periods of clarity followed by regressions into old patterns. But even regression is not failure. It is another opportunity to see the wound more clearly. The unconscious teaches in spirals, not straight lines. Each repetition brings you deeper, closer to the core. And at the core is the child who still waits for your love. That is the final truth. No one else can give it to you, no lover, no friend, no community can heal the wound of being unseen if you yourself continue to abandon that child within. The empath's journey culminates not in saving others, but in saving themselves. Only then do they find the freedom to love without chains. And yet, I must warn you, the path of individuation is lonely. To reclaim yourself means to step out of the patterns that bound you to others. Some will not understand. Some will accuse you of being selfish, of changing, of abandoning them. In truth, what you abandon is not them, but the false bond created by your unconscious wound. Real bonds can withstand your boundaries. Only unhealthy attachments will fall away. This is the cost of sovereignty. The willingness to lose what is false in order to gain what is true. But I tell you, the reward is great, for on the other side of loneliness is freedom. And in freedom is the capacity for real intimacy. Only when you no longer need others to confirm your existence can you truly meet them as they are. This is why I call the empath's truth dark. It is not flattering. It does not feed the ego. It says, your gift was born of your wound. Your love was born of your pain. Your compassion was often survival in disguise. To hear this feels like death, because it strips away the illusion of being naturally virtuous, special or blessed. But this death is also initiation. To face the darkness is to pass through the gate into wholeness. And on the other side, the empath discovers a new truth. Sensitivity is not merely the scar of trauma, but also the organ of the soul. Once liberated from compulsion, it becomes a channel for wisdom, creativity, and true connection. Imagine then the empath who has integrated their shadow, they no longer collapse under the weight of others' emotions, for they have learned to distinguish what belongs to them and what does not. They no longer give compulsively, for they know that love is not earned by sacrifice. They no longer fear selfishness, for they have discovered that the self must be honored before love can be authentic. Such an empath becomes a beacon, not by absorbing the darkness of others, but by shining their own light. They become like the alchemist's gold, rare, incorruptible, radiant, and their presence is no longer exhausting but enlivening, for it comes not from a wound but from wholeness. This is the possibility that lies within the empath's suffering. The child who learned love through pain can grow into the adult who chooses love through freedom. The gift does not vanish, it deepens. Compassion becomes clearer, wisdom sharper, presence more powerful. Such a soul becomes not the savior of others, but a mirror of possibility, showing others what it means to be whole. That is the true calling of the empath, not to save the world by carrying its wounds, but to transform their own wound into light, and by doing so, to inspire others to do the same. The empath who has lived their life as the child of pain stands finally at a crossroad, a threshold where two destinies unfold before them. On one side lies a familiar path, the endless cycle of absorbing, giving, erasing the self in order to keep love alive. On the other side lies the unknown path, the road of individuation, where they no longer beg for crumbs of affection, but stand as a sovereign being, rooted in the self. This crossing is not easy, for the pull of the old identity is powerful. It whispers seductively, remain as you are, remain the martyr, remain the one who saves. To step onto the unknown road requires faith not in another, not in society, but in one's own inner wholeness. And yet, to remain on the old path is to slowly die. For the empath who continues to live as the wounded child finds that life becomes heavier with each passing year. Relationships drain them, their bodies weaken, their dreams become restless, their souls ache with an unspoken hunger. They give until their essence evaporates, and still they wonder why they feel unseen. This is because no amount of external love can fill the void created by self-abandonment. The wound must be faced from within. To continue in blindness is to remain forever a prisoner of the past. The unconscious will not remain silent. If the empath refuses the call of individuation, the psyche will express its discontent through symptoms, depression, anxiety, fatigue, physical illness. These are not enemies to be destroyed, but messages, warning signs that the soul is starving. Every panic attack is a cry from the inner child, see me. Every sleepless night is the shadow whispering, you cannot live this life forever. Every illness is the body embodying the forgotten truth. You have abandoned yourself. The psyche has infinite creativity in forcing us toward healing, though we resist. The question is whether we will listen before the body and soul collapse completely. To listen is to turn inward. To turn inward is to risk hearing what we have avoided all our lives. The empath must be willing to sit in silence and encounter the one they have most feared themselves. At first, this silence is unbearable. The absence of others' voices, others' needs, others' pain feels like emptiness. They may feel restless, as though without someone else's emotions to hold, they are nothing. But if they endure this silence, slowly another voice emerges, the quiet, trembling voice of the inner child, long silenced. It says, I am here, I need you, do not abandon me again. This is the moment of truth. To turn toward this voice is to begin the work of healing. Healing, however, is not sentimental. It is not merely embracing the child and whispering words of comfort. It is a long, arduous process of integration. The empath must confront the anger of the child, the rage at having been unseen, the resentment towards those who fail to provide love. This anger cannot be bypassed, for it is the energy of the self demanding recognition. To feel it consciously is painful, but to repress it is worse, for repressed anger becomes depression, self-sabotage, illness. To integrate it is to transform it into strength, boundary, clarity. It is to declare, never again will I abandon myself for love. This is the sacred vow of the awakened empath. The archetypal process is always one of death and rebirth. Just as Osiris was dismembered and resurrected, just as Christ descended into the tomb and rose again, just as the alchemist dissolved matter before coagulating it into gold, so too must the empath die to their old self before being reborn into wholeness. This death feels catastrophic. They feel as though they are losing everything, their identity, their relationships, even their very sense of self. But what is dying is not the self, but the mask. What is perishing is not love, but the illusion of love based on pain. And when the mask falls, when the illusion shatters, what remains is the indestructible core, the self that has always waited beneath the wound. This rebirth does not mean the empath ceases to feel. On the contrary, their feeling deepens, but it is no longer compulsive. They no longer drown in others' emotions, for they know the boundary of their own being. They no longer confuse compassion with self-erasure, for they have learned that true compassion flows from fullness, not from emptiness. Their sensitivity remains, but it is refined, sharpened, no longer a raw wound, but a finely tuned instrument. They can still enter the depths of another soul, but they do so by choice, not by compulsion. And they know how to return to themselves afterward. This is the difference between slavery and mastery. The empath who integrates their shadow becomes a powerful presence in the world. They are no longer consumed by the need to save, but their very existence becomes healing. Others feel safe in their presence, not because the empath absorbs their pain, but because the empath's wholeness allows others to glimpse their own. They radiate authenticity, and authenticity is contagious. This is what it means to be a healer in the true sense, not to carry the wounds of others, but to embody the possibility of transformation. The empath, once a prisoner of pain, becomes a midwife of wholeness, guiding others not by sacrifice, but by example. But even at this stage, vigilance is required. The old patterns never vanish completely. They remain in the unconscious, waiting for moments of weakness. The empath may still feel the temptation to overgive, to rescue, to dissolve. The difference now is that they recognize these impulses for what they are, the echoes of the wounded child, not the voice of the self. They can pause, reflect, and choose differently. Each time they choose themselves, the new pattern strengthens, the old one weakens. This is the work of a lifetime, the endless dance between shadow and light. Individuation is never complete, but always unfolding. And so, to the empath who listens to these words, I say this: your truth is dark, but it is not hopeless. You have carried pain as though it were love. You have mistaken survival for compassion. You have abandoned yourself to save others. But within you lies the power to transform this wound into wisdom. You are not condemned to repeat the past. You are called to integrate it, to redeem it, to become whole. The child within you still waits, not for the love of others, but for your own embrace. Give it, and you will discover that the love you have sought all your life was never outside, but within. And when you do, your empathy will no longer be a chain that binds you to suffering. It will be a light, freely given, flowing from the inexhaustible source of the self. You will love without fear, give without depletion, feel without drowning. You will no longer be the child who learned love through pain, but the adult who has transfigured pain into freedom. This is your destiny. This is the alchemy of your soul. And so, my friends, I leave you not with answers, but with images. For the psyche speaks not in conclusions, but in symbols. You came here perhaps seeking clarity, seeking a formula for how to bear the weight of feeling, how to heal the wound of love through pain. But what I have given you is not a prescription. It is a path. It is the descent into the underworld of your own soul, where the child you once abandoned still waits. And if you dare to enter, you will find that the darkness is not your enemy, but your teacher, your guide, your initiator. Do not be afraid of your anger, for it is the fire that will warm you. Do not fear your selfishness, for it is the seed of your wholeness. Do not despise your sensitivity, for it is the instrument by which the self sings, embrace all that you have rejected, for only in embracing can you be whole. The world does not need more martyrs who vanish into the wounds of others. The world needs souls who have walked into their own shadows and returned with light. That is the task before you. That is the destiny of the empath. You are not condemned to be forever the child of pain. You are invited to become the adult of wholeness, the sovereign of your own inner kingdom. The path will be lonely. Yes, you will lose false attachments. Yes, you will face the silence of your own being. Yes, but in that silence, you will hear for the first time the voice of the self, eternal, unbroken, radiant, and from that voice will flow a love so deep, so clear, that you will no longer confuse it with pain. It will be love that liberates, not love that enslaves. So go now and dare to betray the old law that told you love must hurt. Dare to turn your compassion inward. Dare to love the child within you as fiercely as you have loved the world. In doing so, you will not love others less, you will love them more truly, more freely, more divinely. This is the paradox, the alchemy, the mystery, that only in becoming whole do we truly give, and only in giving from wholeness does the world receive. Remember, the unconscious never forgets, but it also never ceases to heal. The symbols that rise in your dreams, the emotions that flood your body, the shadows that appear in your relationships, they are not enemies, they are messengers. Listen to them, honor them, for they will lead you step by step into the fullness of who you are. And when one day you look back, you will no longer see only the child who learned love through pain. You will see the soul who walked through fire, who descended into shadow, who wrestled with demons, and who emerged not broken, but transfigured. That, my friends, is individuation. That is the miracle hidden in your wound. That is the dark truth that becomes radiant when you dare to face it. Now the rest is silence. The rest is your work, your descent, your rebirth. May you walk it with courage. May you claim the wholeness that has always been yours.